Chapter 7. Chicago. Tuesday, April 8, 2014, 3 a.m. While Gabriella slept comfortably on the living room couch, Madeline lay awake in her bed with the candles lit and glowing as usual. She'd fallen asleep for a short time, only to be jolted awake by another terrorizing nightmare when her alcohol sedation had worn off. Lacking the desire to continue drinking, she was forced to deal with the distressful events and revelations of the day behind her. Grief-stricken, angry, and overcome by regret, she knew that regardless of her feelings about Gabriella, she would once again have to assume the role of protector and contemplated their options. While reminiscing over a glass-framed photograph of herself and Maxwell, Madeline's agitation only compounded. It was the day of his college graduation and the last photo she'd ever taken with him. She had her arms locked firmly around his waist, and they both wore luminous smiles. Maxwell was tall, handsome, and had the strapping muscular build of a quarterback. He and Madeline shared the same light caramel brown skin and attractive, almost identical features known to all three Jackson children. With Maxwell preparing to enter law school and Madeline a pre-medical student, they finally thought the horrific past was behind them and that they could finally live the lives they'd always imagined. Together as children, Madeline and Maxwell had survived a rigorously militant lifestyle, subject to daily punishments consisting of cruel and unusual methods of abuse. Their father had expected nothing less than perfection, and the likelihood of obtaining excellence in his eyes was an impossible feat. Sacrifice is the key to service and obedience was his motto, and sacrifice they did. Living in a world that rejected them by day and in the secret den of devils by night was tolerable only through hope, faith, and resilience. After a miracle disguised as a tragedy forced the immediate removal of all three Jackson children from their parents' household when Madeline was 14, they finally had a chance at survival. But having strenuously warned their children never to leave or betray the family, Charles and Claire Jackson, both exposed and humiliated, had vowed revenge. Unfortunately for Maxwell, his freedom had come too late. The torture he'd sustained proved too much to overcome, and he would never attend law school, and he would never escape the life of misery inflicted by the parents whose evil had destroyed him. And that hopeful day, smiling with Madeline in his garnet red cap and gown, would be the last time he ever saw his sister again outside federal prison walls. As Madeline continued to stare at the picture, Gabriella's words rang over and over in her head. "Do you remember the last time you saw Max?" Of course she did. She'd tried to forget. The experience had caused a landslide of grief that would torment her for the rest of her life. 4 months after Maxwell's trial and subsequent conviction, Madeline, 23 at the time and in her first year of medical school, had gone for her first and final visit. Maxwell had been officially sentenced to 2 life terms without the possibility of parole in an Illinois federal penitentiary for a double homicide with special circumstances. If the death penalty hadn't been suspended in Illinois, he would have sat on death row. Instead, he was confined indefinitely to a level 1 maximum security prison, where most inmates sat in their cells 23 hours a day, with few exceptions. But Maxwell wasn't like the other inmates. The warden had kept him away from the general population, and he received a wide variety of superior privileges unheard of for a prisoner of his caliber, including private visits. His cell was secluded in one of the abandoned buildings once used for executions, and that was where he had been the last time Madeline saw him. In a solitary chamber at the end of a locked maze of a dozen old barred prison doors, and down a long, damp corridor lined with rancid-smelling empty cells. Maxwell's confinement and the actions he'd taken to achieve it had been beyond Madeline's comprehension, and the only words she could remember saying to him were, "How could you do it? How?" He gave her the answer to her question that day, and she never went back. Madeline sat up in bed, pushed the memory of Maxwell's graduation out of her mind, and set the picture on her nightstand. Channeling her aggravation, she sat down at her bedroom desk and began to meticulously disassemble and clean both her black handgun and her matching silver one. She had never understood the justifications contributing to his special treatment while in prison, but for unspoken reasons the warden had granted Maxwell absolute protection in one of the country's most notoriously dangerous prisons, as long as he followed the rules. And while the notion of untouchable immunity was questionable, Maxwell's untimely death while under it was the most perplexing inconsistency of all. Madeline had deserted Maxwell and left him all alone, just as Gabriella had said. And now figuring out who or what was responsible for his death was the foremost thought on Madeline's mind. If Gabriella was right, and Charles and Claire Jackson were actively planning their demise, the prison where Maxwell died would be the first place to investigate. After reassembling both guns, Madeline checked and adjusted the sights and simultaneously dry-fired the triggers. She then purchased and printed a round-trip plane ticket to Chicago, secured a rental car, and dressed herself warmly. With a packed carry-on bag ready to go, she locked the black gun in her bedroom safe, grabbed her black trench coat, and blew out the candles. After leaving a note for Gabriella on the kitchen table, Madeline quietly walked down the hall to the front door. "Where are you going?" Gabriella asked sharply from behind, standing at the other end of the dimly lit hallway. She looked like a ghost in the long white nightgown Madeline had lent her to sleep in. "I'm catching the first plane to Chicago," Madeline said. "It doesn't make sense what you say happened to Max. The whole point of solitary is protection. I'm going up there to find out what happened." "What's the point of that? He's dead." "I need confirmation," Madeline said, grabbing her keys. "Well, then I'm coming with you. I can't stay here by myself." "No, you're not. Staying here is exactly what you're going to do. Trust me, you don't want anything to do with that place. Once you go in, you can never wipe it off. Don't tell anyone where you are, and don't tell anyone where I'm going." Later that morning, Dr. Fields sat at his desk enjoying a large cup of steaming black coffee as he listened to his voicemail. He was surprised to hear Madeline's voice on one of the messages. "Harry, it's Madeline. I've got an emergency and won't be able to make it in today. I'm really sorry. I'll be in later this evening to check on my patients. Call my cell if you need me. Bye." He was not pleased. Madeline stood outside the first set of sliding steel gates leading into the Federal Correctional Penitentiary of Eastern Illinois and clutched her rosary. Housed inside were some of the most ferocious criminals in the country, all of whom were serving a minimum 20-year sentence. The wicked energy of miserable hopelessness, ruthless violence, and pure evil radiated through the walls, infecting all who came within distance. If someone worked at or resided in East Penn, as the affiliates called it, was a family member of a prisoner, or lived within a 100-mile radius of the expansive historical prison, they regarded it as hell's limbo. Mentally transported back to the last time she stood in the exact same spot, Madeline's heart beat rapidly. 6 years prior, she had fled the grounds with blood splattered on her face in a full panic attack, crying and petrified by what she'd witnessed. This time, after the correctional officers invasively processed her through security and led her to the administration offices, she curbed the haunting memories of her past and braced herself for whatever she might encounter. Irrepressible thoughts of unease, mostly about Gabriella, raced through Madeline's head as she waited outside the office of the security manager. Because the events following Gabriella's arrival had happened so quickly, Madeline hadn't been able to question her thoroughly on the details of her hospital release. The news about Maxwell's death had been so devastating that Madeline couldn't have conceived worrying about something so minor, and she had never seen Gabriella in such a fretful state of emotion. Interrogating her further would have been unfeelingly harsh and counterproductive. The sister Madeline remembered was selfish and cruel, always ready to do what she wanted, when she wanted, with no regard for her actions. The sister Madeline saw the day before was scared and frail, and she worried about having left her alone in New Orleans. But there had been no other option. Madeline had to keep her problems with Gabriella temporarily quarantined while simultaneously dealing with the more pressing ones, and she was confident Gabriella would be safe at the apartment until she returned that night. But if their parents had found Gabriella while confined to a confidential psychiatric inpatient hospital, Madeline wondered if they already knew where she lived as well. After a 20-minute wait, a hard-looking, ruggedly attractive man opened the door and walked up to Madeline. He was Japanese-American, 6 feet tall, and even though his tightly cut gray hair placed him in his 50s, he had a powerful physique and smooth, sun-tanned skin. "Dr. Knight, I'm Gordon Covey, the security manager for the prison," he said in a deep, soothing voice. "We spoke earlier this morning regarding your brother, Maxwell Jackson. Come on in." He shook Madeline's hand and led her into his office, closed the door behind them, and pulled out her chair before sitting down across from her at his desk. "Thank you for taking this meeting. You're a hard man to get a hold of," Madeline said. "I'm here to find out the details about what happened to my brother and collect his personal belongings." "Well, to start, your brother was stabbed multiple times by another inmate during his transfer from solitary confinement. He was on the schedule for transport to an off-site undisclosed psychiatric unit." "Why was he being transferred?" Gordon picked up Maxwell's file already on his desk and opened the medical records section. "Hallucinations, suicidal behavior, and complaints of possession. So why not treat him here?" "We didn't have the ability to handle a psychiatric case of his magnitude. It was the only option without transferring him out of state. Unfortunately, I can't help you out much as far as belongings go because he was killed almost 5 weeks ago. Anything unclaimed after 30 days, including the body, is sent out for disposal." Madeline hadn't thought Maxwell's death could have hit her any harder, but it just had. Blood rushed to her head and her face turned hot. "Can I see the file?" she asked. Gordon handed Madeline the file. He felt sorry for her. It wasn't every day a young attractive woman came into his office to collect the belongings of an inmate already sent out to a potter's field. She looked so young, he thought, far too young to be a doctor. Madeline flipped quietly through the thick file, carefully scanning every page, unsure what she was looking for. When she pulled out Maxwell's visitation log, she was shocked to see her parents had been to the prison multiple times to see him during the past 6 years. But 6 months before his death on March 6, 2014, their visits stopped. "What?" she asked herself quietly. "We swore never to speak to them again. Why would he agree to see them?" She turned to Gordon. "You've got to have some sort of surveillance videos showing the stabbing. Can I see them?" "Dr. Knight, your brother was serving a life sentence for the brutal murders of his own wife and child. Even behind these doors, there's an inmate's code of conduct. It was common knowledge he was being transferred out of the facility. Nobody was surprised by his murder. It was a random stabbing. Please just show me the videos." Gordon snuck Madeline into the prison's security surveillance room and locked the door. No one outside his office was allowed inside without proper clearance or a warrant, but he wanted to help if only to provide her with closure. He searched through the media library and recovered the disc recording of the day and time frame of Maxwell's murder. When he placed the disc into the audio-visual playback system, 8 screens with different views powered on, and Madeline watched intently as he tracked forward to the moments before the incident. Maxwell finally appeared on the screen, and they watched as 2 armed guards escorted him through the cylinder-shaped general population level in wrist and leg chains and wearing a bright red jumpsuit with his number on it. 2 rows of inmates, also in chains and wearing orange jumpsuits with similar numbers, passed Maxwell going in the opposite direction. Suddenly, an unchained inmate appeared clinging to the side of the central sniper's tower. With superhuman speed, he jumped into the air over the guards, paused mid-flight, and brutally plunged a jagged-edged knife into Maxwell's right side and multiple times in his jugular. Afterward, the murderer vanished faster than he'd appeared, and the guards stood by motionless as chaos amongst the prisoners erupted, watching as Maxwell convulsed in a pool of his own blood. "Oh my God!" Madeline shrieked. "Rewind it and pause on the murderer's face. I want to see who it is." Gordon played the video again, but couldn't get a clear view of the murderer's face, only his inmate number. He typed the number into the computer and initiated a record search. "That's weird. We have no record of an inmate with that number. And I've never seen him before," he said, thoroughly confused and continuing to search. Madeline looked in closer at the screen, expertly took over the controls of the sophisticated monitoring device, zoomed in tighter, and switched the main screen view to the camera catching the view from the front. Her eyes widened in horror, and she put her hand over her mouth to stop from screaming when she recognized the face of the man who'd slain her brother. Madeline closed her eyes as dark, forgotten memories from her childhood flashed through her mind. She remembered a gigantic man named Stefan, the inmate on the video who'd stabbed her brother at various stages throughout her life, always with her father. She recalled Stefan riding in the passenger seat of her father's patrol cruiser, sitting next to him during a department dinner party, and posted at his right side while standing at the podium after receiving his coveted police chief's badge. "It's Stefan," Madeline thought. "My parents really did have something to do with this. I never should have left Gabriella at home alone." Madeline needed to leave Chicago and get back to New Orleans as soon as possible. Careful not to alarm Gordon or indicate she knew the man on the screen, she gently touched his shoulder. "I have to go," she said. "This has all been very difficult for me, and I have a lot to think about. Thank you again for everything you've helped me with." "I'm sorry I couldn't do more." "Actually, you can. Would you mind making me a copy of my brother's file?" Gordon paused. He knew he shouldn't. This girl is going to get me into a lot of trouble, he thought. But he picked up the file and went out to make her a copy. Madeline ejected the surveillance disc and slipped it into her jacket.